all over the world. So Harold and I, we are wondering for a long time, so what happens between these areas, between these industrial clusters? Our idea is they need to be connected because it's very risky, dangerous to just focalize on specific field. We don't know what's happening outside. And in our age, perhaps this is more dangerous. So we have some cases like BlackBerry, like Nokia, who focused, specialized just in one specific area. Then they collapse all of a sudden. So Harold and I think, so in the paper, we would like to argue that for firms, especially multinational firms, to develop a new product, they need to know to use different types of technologies in different fields. So then they need to be connected with these different knowledge pools. And this is the idea. And actually, there are some anecdotal cases to support this idea. So in high tech, we see firms from Silicon Valley, they go to Shenzhen for hardware, go to Bangalore for software. In some fashion, creative industries, Hollywood firms, they go to Vancouver because Vancouver is strong in post-production effects. In traditional industries, such as textile, clothing, so firms from Wenzhou, they go to Prato in Italy. So Harold and I, so we are thinking, is this something general? So we found some statistical evidence to support this idea. So this is the question of the paper. In the paper, we want to ask a simple question. Are firms from industrial clusters more likely to invest in clusters in the same field? So we collected and analyzed 3,500 investment cases from Canada and China, and we do find strong evidence. So firms indeed from clusters, and showing in the figure, they invest, they choose cluster areas. From our analysis, from the results, firms from clusters are 40% more likely than firms from other areas to choose a cluster area. So in other words, indeed, firms connect clusters. And many of these clusters, they are embedded in cities, in global cities. So what we see is aerospace firms from here in Montreal, they choose Shanghai because Shanghai is also strong in aerospace. And telecommunication firms from Waterloo, they choose Shenzhen. Banks from Beijing, they choose Toronto. So these are the patterns we found. And the cluster level, so firms, they invest across the similar clusters to get access to different types of knowledge in their field. Then they are able to innovate faster than their counterparts. So this is the idea, the founding of the paper. And I think the idea of the paper joins the two other papers in the webinar to show that if we narrow down to the sub-national level, to clusters, to cities, then perhaps we are able to find some new pattern, new process, new mechanisms for multinationals to understand their choices, their strategies, and also their challenges in our age. For example, this is Uber's internationalization process. Started in 2011 in San Francisco. In 4 years, we have run operations in more than 400 cities. Airbnb is a similar story. So if we think about these firms, they internationalize very fast. For these firms, the country scale is less important than the urban scale. So for these firms, if we look at the order or their city choices, what's the logic behind? There must be some logic behind that is very important for their success. The IB, we have lots of theory, deep understanding on how firms go abroad to choose another country. So on the country choices, we have different measures on distance. But on the city level, what's the theory? What's the explanation to explain firms' internationalization process at the city level? So I think then if we focus on the subnational, on the city cluster level, we are able to understand some new challenges, new processes of multinational firms. We need also understand their challenges nowadays. Here, for example, Amazon, 2 years ago, they made a plan to choose a city in North America to establish their second headquarters. Last year, they made a plan. So they chose New York and Virginia. But in New York, I think they chose Long Island. It's a suburban area, not in Manhattan. And the local community, there was a lot of protest. So then Amazon had to cancel the plan. So this is a story, but the question is how could we understand the story from a theoretical perspective? Now, we need to go down to the community, to the country level, to the city level, then we are able to understand the challenges of firms like Amazon in our age. So this is, I think, some idea perhaps we can explore further in IB, but also in economic geography. City is something, it's a distinctive skill in our society right now. It changed so fast. It changed fundamentally in the past decades. So earlier in the 70s, in the 60s, the trend is economic activities diffused from the big cities to small towns, to the rural areas. And in the past decade, we see the reverse process. Some big cities, some superstar cities, they are sunken up talent, innovation, jobs, and also innovation. So how could we explain the process? There are lots of problems in the process. It's high-level economic and social disparity between superstar cities and all the other areas, but also within cities. So what we are seeing in the past decades, the background for firms, for multinational firms, have changed so fast, have changed so fundamentally. So what does it mean for multinational firms? And this is something I think we need to understand, we need to think further in IB, but also in economic geography. I hope that perhaps there will be some more links between the two fields to explore these questions together. So these are some of our ideas on the topic of our paper. I hope that they can stimulate some further discussion on the topic. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, thank you, Pengfei, for your introduction to your empirical work. The ideas behind empirical work, as you emphasized, we have had quite a few conversations between people in the field of economic geography and the field of international business. And actually, Mudambi is going to speak later, is one of the people who has been involved in that, and we've had special issues on that in GIBS in the past. So this so economic geography provides one of the conceptual foundations for some of the discussions in our field. And now I move on to Christine Côté, who is actually also joining us from Montreal, although she usually lives in London, England. And she's going to talk about her work on the service sector.
Right. So, so thank you, Klaus, for this opportunity to discuss our recent paper. It's my pleasure to be presenting on behalf of my co-authors who maybe hopefully are watching at the moment, Saul Estrin and Daniel Shapiro. Our paper is focused on the role of cities as location destinations for multinationals. But more importantly, and perhaps what differentiates it from the others, it's focused very much in the area of policy, policy in the area of trade and investment in services, and also the role played by country economic diplomacy, city diplomacy, and corporate diplomacy in this regard. So what I want to do is start by sharing with you a short video. Hopefully the technology manages to work, and it sort of summarizes the arguments of our paper. I'll just caveat that by saying, obviously, my overview today is very brief. It's a brief summary of a much more rich and complex paper, but maybe if I ask, I think Klaus is going to do the technology for us.
Trade in services, especially digital and knowledge-based, is growing faster than trade in goods. Dr. Christine Côté, Professor Saul Estrin, and Professor Daniel Shapiro are investigating the role of cities and services within international trade and investment policies. These services involve a complex movement of people, capital, and knowledge. Services trade is often centralized in global cities. Most relevant policies focus on countries via traditional economic diplomacy. Services are harder to define in traditional trade and investment agreements and are subject to various behind-the-border restrictions. This contextual distance related to culture and regulation hampers trade at the country level. Global cities are natural homes for these activities. Cities act to attract high value-added knowledge activities through city diplomacy. Understanding cities is critical to both policymakers and companies. Economic diplomacy must fully account for cities and city diplomacy. The importance of cities makes corporate diplomacy more complex, and global corporations must adjust accordingly.
Back to you, Christine.
Yes, right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Klaus, for that. Let me now just serve to provide a little more detail behind our arguments in my remaining time. So as part of our story, I first want to start with the consideration of trade and services. So trade and services, as you are probably well aware, is growing a lot faster than trade in goods, 60% faster, and could constitute as much as 40% of global trade on a value-added basis. And while one might expect trade and services to be easier for policymaking because distance is less likely to be important, evidence actually suggests otherwise. Trade and services is more complex because it involves the movement of people, knowledge, capital, but it's also more difficult to define than trade in goods. And services tend to be subject to greater behind-the-border restrictions. So one of our arguments is that while geographic distance may matter less, contextual distance, we argue, actually matters more. If we look at current economic diplomacy and trade and investment, it's focused in two areas. So it's focused on both negotiations of trade agreements as well as export and investment promotion. However, we argue current services, trade, and investment agreements lacks the necessary breadth and depth to make it effective. And really, investment promotion, trade and investment promotion activities has been shown to have mixed results. Just to maybe add a little bit more detail to that, if we think of existing service trade agreements, they don't consistently and effectively, for example, cover sectors which are emerging and particularly important, like new ones in the area of e-commerce. They're designed to address export of services as a final activity and not so much as an intermediate input in the context, for example, of multiple suppliers and locations, as we find within global value chains. Additionally, we'd argue services trade agreements tend to provide a lot of special treatment to countries' sensitive sectors, and what that ends up doing is limiting their effectiveness through market access restrictions. So we're left with this question as to whether the current economic diplomacy model can actually support trade and investment in services. I think the second part of our story is the consideration of the role of global cities, obviously relevant to our webinar today. Cities we see playing a critical role in facilitating the creation and the trade of knowledge-based services. And this is because cities tend to generate agglomeration economies, leading to the co-location of knowledge-based firms. And this has led to the emergence of global cities, which we see is characterized by a number of things. The presence of advanced multinational business service providers, the associated interlocking network of cities, and also the presence of innovation clusters that really serve to promote both the location of knowledge production and the creation of new knowledge-based firms. So this network of connecting global cities tends to reduce spatial transaction costs, and therefore also reduce distance. for trade and investment in knowledge-based goods and services. So what we're arguing is, first, we have this phenomenon where distance affects the trade and services. And second, we see that global cities are really helping to reduce this distance for service-based firms. So the other thing we found is that cities engage actively in their own diplomacy, and this is focused mainly in high-tech and digital services. And this is separate from economic diplomacy at the national level, and rarely we found does it tend to be coordinated across the levels of government. So the city diplomacy, for example, includes formal and informal agreements among cities, together with activities aimed at investment promotion, for example, at the city level. And we detail these initiatives for some global cities in our paper, with, I guess, the main finding being that they tend to be quite heterogeneous and diverse. So what we're proposing in the context of our paper is a three-tier framework of economic diplomacy that does incorporate this aspect of city diplomacy. And our argument is that this would recognize that global cities are really the location decision points of much of the knowledge and innovation-based activities within trade and.
Okay, Christine has warned us beforehand that she may have technical problems. I'll use the opportunity to remind everyone in the audience that we do have the Q&A function. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask any of the panelists, including Pengfei, who you already have seen, or Christine, who is hopefully going to be back in a second, or in fact, Ram, who will come shortly, then please put it in the Q&A. And I am hoping that Christine gets back in very quickly. Let's give her 10 more seconds. Otherwise, I'll move straight over to Ram Mudambi. And maybe at the beginning of the Q&A, we give Christine an opportunity to round up her argument. That's a bit unfortunate. She was just talking about the interesting policy implications for cities. Okay, Ram, would you like to take over? Unmute yourself.
Unmute, share screen. Hang on a second.
I just see Christine is coming back. Christine, do you want to continue? We were just chatting about.
I'm really sorry. Yes,
You were talking about the city diplomacy, which is really the interesting part of your paper. If you could just round up your argument there.
Yes, I'm really sorry. I did mention to Klaus when I joined that I'm having a few technical difficulties. I really had one last aspect of our argument to wrap up, and hopefully I can do this without hopefully losing my screen again. So following on from that argument with respect to city diplomacy, the next question was really around what does this mean for the multinational and the relationship with respect to cities, which is very much the focus of this webinar. So under traditional economic diplomacy, when multinationals negotiate to enter a market, their corporate diplomacy tends to be predominantly directed at the country level institutions. And our analysis suggests that once cities are taken into account, the policy environment really becomes much more complex, and multinationals really need to focus perhaps on acquiring additional capabilities to undertake corporate diplomacy at the various levels. One of the things we do in our paper is we look at some examples. One in particular is one I'd like to share briefly with you, and it's the example of Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto. And it really helps illustrate this complexity of corporate diplomacy that multinationals face. So Sidewalk Labs, as you are probably aware, is a subsidiary of Alphabet, the parent company of Google. And they launched a project aimed at revitalizing the Toronto waterfront by creating a smart city via the use of a public-private partnership. They envisaged a sort of urban operating system, is how they described it, and one which could be exported as a model elsewhere. And really at points during the negotiations and the scoping of the project, there were ambitions of covering a sort of 350-acre part of the Toronto waterfront. So very ambitious project. The project launched to great enthusiasm in 2017, a lot of public support from the federal government in Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister, for example, was on site or on hand for the main media launch event. So there was a lot of national government support. There were, however, many controversial issues in the areas of data governance, privacy protection, requiring really negotiations at 3 levels of government, and particularly at the local level, where there was intense opposition from local civic leaders and Toronto residents. So probably not surprising because the perceived costs of the project were very localized, which can often facilitate kind of collective action initiatives of this nature. But in the end, the firm's ability to manage all 3 levels of government through their corporate diplomacy, as well as the media narrative, really led to the failure of the project. And it was ultimately terminated after quite a massive reduction in scope. So as I mentioned, initially envisaging a 350-acre project, in the end, they were down to sort of 12 acres. Ultimately, the project failed due to economic and political infeasibility of the project, and really the company's inability to manage their corporate diplomacy at all levels. The point here is that while we see a need for economic diplomacy, particularly as it relates to services, trade, and investment, to really incorporate city diplomacy, we also recognize that the multinational corporate diplomacy needs to adjust to the role of cities in their strategic location decisions.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'll now move on. Ram, I think corporate diplomacy is a good starting point for you. That I think that overlaps with what you have to talk. Please go ahead, Ram.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I'm just going to, can you hear me, Klaus?
I can hear you and I can see your full screen, and now I can see your PPT.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I think my paper here, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Mark Lorzen and Andreas Schotter. Mark Lorzen from Copenhagen Business School and Andreas Schotter from Ivy in Canada. This research forms part of a very long-standing, I would say, as Klaus mentioned, my work on bridging economic geography, international business, and innovation in a research network called iBegin. The iBegin, we're going to be talking essentially this paper about a future research agenda for the whole iBegin research initiative, which has been going on now for about 12 years. The 2020 webinar will be on November 20th of this year, featuring David Thies of UC Berkeley and Max von Zedwitz of Copenhagen Business School. Okay, let me move right along into this particular paper. Our iBegin philosophy, this paper is very much encapsulates the idea of the iBegin philosophy, which is that human connectivity is the web that underpins all civilization. It's an invisible yet very tangible power that has shaped all human development. And this little hockey stick graph that you can see over there gives you a very clear picture of exactly what we're talking about. And the idea is very simply that any one of us were parachuted down into a desert island all by ourselves, our ability to create value would be catastrophically reduced. The value we create is through connecting in a social and an economic sense with society as a whole. Multinationals are a clear part of this. Here's a little bit of data looking at all US cities. And what we see is their innovation connectivity with the rest of the world outside the US is very strongly and significantly connected to their value creation capability when we measure it in terms of employment numbers or whether we measure it in terms of wages. So ultimately, the whole idea of multinationals as the network firms that go to cities, connect cities, as Pengfei pointed out, where they connect them with other cities, they create a lot of value. In fact, they create the vast majority of all wealth that is created on Earth today. However, this the problem is there is a problem associated with this. As Christine pointed out, global connectedness disrupts local connectedness, and this leads to populism. Global connectedness is likely to increase city regions' average wealth, but this wealth is likely to be very unevenly distributed locally. We have local spatial disconnectedness because ultimately knowledge-intensive activities, which are the source, which are the root, which reap the vast majority of all value creation, these tend to be concentrated in very particular parts of urban city regions. Other areas, which we might call hinterlands, tend to lose jobs, tend to lose value creation. So when multinationals come in, they tend to disrupt this local connectedness that used to be in place. Therefore, we have issues of exclusion, issues of depopulation. We get issues of social disconnectedness. We have less opportunities as cities become increasingly knowledge hotspots. There are fewer and fewer opportunities for low-skilled, no-knowledge individuals. These low-skilled individuals now face wage pressures. There are no reference wage levels. They have low negotiating power. There's less focus on inclusion and training and so on. And so ultimately, this global connectedness is incredible value-creating, wealth-creating engine of multinational enterprises. It affects local agglomeration economies through offshoring, through specialized support services, and the replacement of local connectedness. Imports replace local supplies, offshoring activity, hinterlands no longer take low-skill activities. Global connectedness can crowd out local connectedness, and all this situation which we had through a locally bounded value-creating system of a century ago, that tends to disappear, and they create a lot of discontent through a conflict of interests between the high knowledge workers and the low knowledge workers. So are multinational enterprises part of the problem? Are they part of the solution? Now, there are two possible situations. We say in our research, in our paper, we point to two possible futures. One is, and that is down at the bottom there, that's a negative possibility, which is global orchestration. The multinational builds its international connectedness, replacing local connectedness, ignoring corporate diplomacy, in Christine's words, if you will. They just focus entirely on value creation for the firm, and the firm may do very, very well. The multinational gains. However, local low knowledge workers lose. In a paper we published some years ago in Industrial and Corporate Change, we looked precisely at the example of Detroit. And we found, to our surprise, that the Detroit city region, which is a pen picture of urban collapse, is in fact increasing and becoming more and more successful year after year as a center of the global automotive innovation network. So, in fact, the Detroit automotive innovation system is highly successful. In fact, it is thriving. It is doing better today in 2020 than it has ever done in the past. However, this has not benefited the city. The city has collapsed. On the other hand, we get a positive outcome where multinationals renew local connectedness through investing in the local entrepreneurial ecosystem. We call this strategy local spawning. Local startups create both high and low knowledge employment. And if multinationals engage in this way, it's possible that MNEs can be part of the solution. I'm going to give you a few successful local spawning examples. And I will take a small issue with some things that you heard before in the examples that you heard from both Pengfei and Christine. First of all, the example of Seattle. Obviously, Amazon, the example that Pengfei gave us in New York, faced a lot of opposition, perhaps through failure. What I would argue there was that was a poor corporate strategy in terms of location. Multinational enterprises engage with cities all the time, but this competition policy, highly publicized way in which Amazon went about the HQ2 was basically a sure way to cause failure. In Amazon's home location, if we look at that, Amazon, Boeing, Microsoft have spawned, that there's some data from HEC Meyer and others in the last 10 years, over 66,000 startup companies. If we look at the Seattle Innovation per year output, we see it's been rising very steadily, even if we take the big three, Amazon, Boeing, and Microsoft, out of this. So with this, we have an even stronger example when we look at the case of Helsinki in Europe. In the case of Helsinki, the collapse of Nokia in 2010 did not slow down Helsinki at all, because Nokia had engaged, had created this innovation ecosystem in the Helsinki area that even after Nokia collapsed, Nokia disappeared, Helsinki continued to thrive. They continued to produce more and more innovation. The small and medium-sized enterprises' continual entrepreneurial startup activity kept the area bubbling. And we see the same example when we look at Kitchener-Waterloo and the collapse of RIM in 2010 or so. So what are our lessons going forward? We know that the global economy is going through an exponential change in terms of the nature of global production and innovation systems. As Richard Florida pointed out, 15 years ago, the global knowledge landscape is spiky. And in fact, the local knowledge systems are considerably more concentrated than production systems. As our 2015 Detroit paper shows, knowledge systems are also much more deeply rooted. They remain in place for very long periods of time, and they're getting more and more so. What this tells us is that these particular areas of the world that are becoming more and more connected, the knowledge landscape becoming more and more spiky. And so cities need to engage with this increased knowledge intensity going forward. And there's some data that just was published earlier this year in February in Nature, looking at 170 years of data, and they show that high knowledge industries are becoming more and more concentrated over the last 170 years, and this concentration rate is increasing dramatically. The graph I show you here is from our own research, and that shows you again the tremendous spikiness of the knowledge landscape. So this is the greatest challenge of our time. These changes are a major source of the current wave of populism that is sweeping the globe. Local governments need to design policies that encourage local spawning. The example we saw in New York of some of the fanning of the flames of the dispossessed is perhaps an example, is a clear example of what can happen if local governments do not control their more radical elements. We can see basically increasing urban collapse. The wealth that is created, we are creating incredible amounts of wealth, but this wealth needs to be distributed more widely. Unless low knowledge workers believe that they have much to gain from the global economy, the future is indeed very bleak. And so this is really studying how multinationals can engage in local spawning, how local city governments can engage with multinationals going forward. Mechanically, this is going to be a tremendously important thing. I'll say a last few words in the last 30, 50 seconds or so, talking about COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic may change work patterns and organization and reduce the attractiveness of city regions, city centers, and it may reinforce suburbanization. But suburbs are still parts of city regions. And so ultimately the attractive city regions is going to continue to be strong even with COVID-19. People are not picking up and moving to the middle of Idaho. So ultimately, but this is some more musings about the pandemic innovation versus production systems, which I can talk about if there are some questions. I'll leave you with the Nobel laureate, John Steinbeck. Of course, the story goes on and on, nothing finishes. Remember, you finish your paper, it's a little that, but ultimately now I leave my story in the hands of future researchers.
Thank you very much, Ram. Thank you, Christine and Pengfei, for your very concise and interesting presentations. Now, we already have a few very good questions to get the discussion started. And please, from the audience, continue to submit your questions to the Q&A function. Please not to the chat function, but the Q&A, and we will get to these. I will take the first question, which actually applies to all three presenters. It's a question about subnational institutions. So clearly here, cities are already subnational institutions. But I would like to broaden the question a little bit by saying, what is actually the correct level of specificity? So I saw in a recent issue of the Journal of Economic Literature that there was a study that showed that locational specificity matters even on the city block or building level. So my question to all three of you is about not only subnational, but what is the relevant subnational level? Can you give some thoughts on that? Maybe starting with Pengfei.
Thanks. If we think about knowledge sharing, for example, there is some literature, some evidence to show that this is very local the zip code level. So there's some evidence to show that, like in Manhattan on the advertising agency, to show that knowledge spillover occurs in just 500 or about 1,000 meters. So about if we work clusters, etc. Yes.
And unfortunately, there seemed to be a little bit of an audio lag problem. So if you can just pick up on your last point. So a radius of about 1,000 meters is what we heard.
Yeah, so this is about the working distance, about 10 to 15 minutes. So the idea is this is how knowledge is shared. It's very parochial. So I think in lots of research on industrial clusters, so we found similar patterns. So I think the idea of the local institutions, we argue about better is some local mindset is very deeply rooted in some local community. It's challenging to move something further away if we think about some contact, some of our cool people we are talking to in a daily life. It's something more local. And this is some skill about knowledge spill over, and it's I think it's hard to scale up even up with the internet or the technologies. So we are able to see face-to-face each other, but I think the idea from the research industrial clusters in climate geographies, there is something face-to-face communication, and it's something very local. So I think that's some thing very important on the subnational level. So if we argue multinational firms, they go abroad to get access to some local knowledge, then knowledge spillover is some other thing very parochial. Then they must be in this community, in this neighborhood, and that's I think something on the local level. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Pengfei. Christine, if I can pose the same question to you, and maybe in your case particularly add to it, which I think was the original question, also about governance institutions. So we know cities and we understand even maybe some neighborhoods in big cities, but what is the relevant level? What is the level of detail that we have to get to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways of looking at this, and we've sort of in our research looked at the predominantly from a policy perspective, but then also the multinational. And I think part of what we're arguing, which in a way goes to answering this, is that all levels of government are actually quite relevant, all levels of subnational government. So from the multinationals perspective, certainly, and the sidewalks example illustrates this, the ability to focus on all levels of government. Maybe the complicating factor may be that how we define, the city and local level may be shifting. Maybe COVID is having an impact on that. Maybe the city involves more of the periphery, and so we're redefining some of those borders. But I think from the multinational perspective, those three levels are all really important in terms of the strategic location decisions, for example, that firms are making. From a policy perspective, I think, while we've traditionally seen, trade and investment policy very much focused at the national level, I think partly what we're arguing is that the subnational governments are very relevant at the local level, at the state, provincial level. And there are many examples of where, trade treaties, for example, don't bind subnational governments. We think of policies around government procurement, for example, and where we have situations where a number of US states haven't signed up to government procurement provisions that the federal state did at the WTO. So all to say, I think all these levels of government are relevant, both for policymakers on the sort of trade side, but also for multinationals that are seeking to make their strategic location decisions.
Great. Let me ask you a follow-up, because it's another question that is in the chat at the moment, which is about this question of levels, and particularly between cities and national governments, if you will. So taking the specific case of the US-China conflicts, and that being a national level conflict, but then city diplomacy being somehow cocooned within this. So cities don't obviously have trade wars, but countries do. So.
Yeah, I saw that question, and it certainly looks like an interesting area for further research in terms of the level of influence that we have actually seen from the city to the national and vice versa. But what I would say is that this sort of highlights the problems we have perhaps with not enough coordination happening on national policy, taking into account the city perspective. And I would say it's an argument more in favor of more coordination of the levels of policy that are taking place, both at the local level and at the federal level. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at the extent to which there is influence taking place. And this example that was given in the question is a good one, but I would argue mainly for more coordination at those various levels, rather than policies very much, focused either just at the city or at the national level.
Right. So Ram, Pengfei was giving some examples of the very high specificity of these sorts of innovative knowledge-intensive activities. What does that imply for your argument about MNE engagement? At what level does it need to happen?
I think one of the problems, Sarianna, is that I think we really need to address the importance of, stress the importance of national context. The U.S. is very specific. City region governance tends to be a very country-specific characteristic. Let me just give a quick example looking at the U.S., which I know the best, and can contrast that with Europe. Now, what competes, as we mentioned, as I mentioned a bit in the talk, is not so much the city center per se, but rather the entire city region, in the sense of Michael Storper. So economic geographers talk about city region, and this is kind of metropolitan area. I've been engaged for the last 5 years with the mayor of Philadelphia's task force, working with the Brookings Institution, looking at the metropolitan competitiveness program. And in that program, we've been talking to metropolitan cities all around the US, the top 120 American metros. And what I find is that there's a tremendous disparity in terms of their coordination. And just to give a quick example, what tends to happen is in eastern cities, like in New York, like in Philadelphia, like in Boston, we tend to have what's called the American donut, which is fundamentally, you have the inner city, which is highly deprived and has terrible schools and nobody wants to live there. And you have except unless they're very young or very old. And then you have the periphery, which is the rich suburbs, which are around it. Now, the problem is that the city governor, the mayor's office, and all the surrounding suburban city administrators want nothing to do with each other. Right, so there's very, very little coordination. So eastern cities tend to function very poorly in terms of city diplomacy, in terms of talking to multinational enterprises. And I work with the international business director of the city of Philadelphia, and she's constantly pulling her hair out because the mayor keeps making all these union things, and he keeps he's extremely leftist. And she keeps saying, no, we're very business friendly, and we want Siemens to come here and invest some more and things like that. And the mayor's constantly shooting her in the foot. So this does not work very well. Right. On the other hand, we have cities that in the West, like San Diego and Phoenix and so on, which tends to basically the city center is allowed to incorporate the suburbs, and so you get much more of a bigger footprint. And the mayor speaks with one voice because both the cities and suburbs are in the same jurisdiction. I think European cities are much more like that. When I talk to people in Helsinki, when I talk to people in Copenhagen, I talk to people in Stockholm, and I find that, at least in Scandinavia, I don't know if this is true with the rest of Europe, there tends to be a much more cohesiveness between the city center and the suburbs. In the sense, there's much more coordination. Cities tend to have, there's much less of this donut problem. And I think if cities are to be successful in terms of working with multinational enterprises, create local spawning, create win-win solutions, these kinds of coordinating this entire city region is going to be very important.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in terms of national, I mean that's another argument as to how to deal with national trade wars, but that's a different. I think that's a separate issue.
Mm-hmm. Pengfei.
Yeah, I just had, I mean, from the geography background, if you think about the country is composed of cities and also small towns, rural areas. So it's, I think, on a broader perspective. So why, for example, in the United States, there's some tension between the country level government and also city level government. I think in the past, for example, when the context was economic activities diffused from cities to other areas, in this context, the cities, towns, rural areas, their interests were basically in line with each other. So on the country level, they can speak with the same voice. But now we see the tendency is the tension, the disparity between some super cluster cities and all the rest areas is so strong. So I think that's also how we can understand, interpret the government on the country level. In the United States, this is how the current administration get elected. National and city level government is actually, in other way, it's the conflict between some big cities and all the other areas. So on the country level, on the city level, perhaps we can also understand some challenges in the politics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from Ram, we're hearing about the conflicts between, so cities are very differently structured. The governance relationships between the different parts are different between different countries. And Pengfei, you also showed the example of Amazon, where then local politics and other societal trends sort of come together to complicate this whole negotiation thing. In the absence of, I think, more questions from the audience, let me ask another question, which has to do with democratic deficits. So the idea that, you know, when we have states, then we at least in theory have a system of representation that kind of tries to make sure that there is some kind of a coherence of public interest that's being promoted. Christine, you may have seen that there is a piece in JIB, a commentary on your article by Frederick Guy that sort of asks this question of, well, in whose interest is this diplomacy being carried out? So if we take diplomacy away from the national level and we take it whether to the city level, or if I interpret you correctly, Ram, to the level of the firm. So the firm is kind of actively engaging in this. What do we do about the democratic deficit? In other words, how do we ensure that there is a balance of public and private interest? Maybe start with Christine and then go from there.
You're muted, Christine.
Now we lost our video. Do you want to jump in, Ram?
Okay. I think the first thing to bear in mind here is I mean, especially in this day and age when we are all seeing the same news feeds from around the world. I think we need to distinguish very clearly between people who are throwing rocks and bottles and people who are actually going to work and producing stuff daily. I think it's very easy to reach a conclusion of democratic deficit when we really have maybe 0.5% or 1% of the population which is rioting, whereas the value creation overall is increasing quite dramatically. I think there is clearly a very strong reality that is going on here, which is what I guess I'll re-emphasize what I mentioned in my presentation, which is a distributional issue. We clearly have low knowledge workers that are not sharing in the pie to the extent that they did in the past. As technology allows us to increasingly find slice activities and coordinate globally these intangible webs, which formerly we could not do. And therefore, formerly we were forced to pay low knowledge workers very high wages. Companies were forced to accede to unions and pay 4 times, 5 times, 6 times the marginal revenue product of low knowledge workers for a long period of time. And so now you may say that it's uneconomic, that it's inefficient, or whatever that is, but that did promote social stability. And so that social stability is something that we want. So we need to find a way. We need to find a way to give low knowledge workers a means of engaging with the global economy. And what the best answer we have in my book is through startup activity. Because startups are firms that cannot afford to pay people $100,000 a year, and therefore provide opportunities for the entire range of workers. One thing that we know, I think it's certainly true in the U.S. To probably the greatest extent, but also true in other parts of the advanced world, that job creation is increasingly growing at SMEs. Giant multinational workforce headcounts are falling everywhere. Like Siemens, Philips, they employ fewer people today than they did in 1985. And this is going to continue to happen. Job creation even in Scandinavia increasingly is in startups, small companies. And these small companies are hiring the entire range of workers from janitorial, custodial staff to others. And very often, one thing we did see in Seattle and in San Francisco is this concept of the Microsoft millionaires and the Google millionaires, people who basically entered as sweeping the floors in Google and were paid with stock early on, and of course now 20 years later they're worth $5 million. So these are not apocryphal examples. These are not examples which are unusual. These are in fact the typical examples of the world going forward. The world going forward, I fully agree with David Aldrich, is going to be an entrepreneurial world. Right? The world of the future is going to be one of mini multinationals, which are globally engaged and which are going to provide opportunities for a much wider range of workers.
Let me ask a follow-up to that before we move to Pengfei again. I think we have unfortunately lost Christine here. So if I understand you correctly, and I'm a little bit sort of characterizing what you're saying, but you're saying that we could have public policy whose aim it was to generate more entrepreneurship, and we've had those kinds of policies, and they have to a large extent failed. And the question is, what is the alternative? Is the alternative some kind of a reoriented corporate strategy that would foster more entrepreneurship, that would foster deeper linkages in the home country, home region of the multinational? Is that more or less what you are advocating?
I'm not saying. I'll only make a small nuance to what you just said, and that is that multinationals have the opportunity of spurring entrepreneurship not only in their headquarters location, but in location of all their major subsidiaries. The Bangalore metro is another area I study very deeply, and that's a very good example. Virtually all the entrepreneurial activity in the Bangalore area has been spurred by foreign multinational subsidiaries. The Microsoft subsidiary, the Google subsidiary, and they all have been spawning hundreds, IBM, hundreds and hundreds of startups. Okay.
So then let me ask about the limits of this, because it sounds like kind of a parallel argument to what has been argued about social responsibility, that it's kind of win-win under the right circumstances, that firms have incentives to engage in this sort of more pro-social behavior. Where do you see the limits, or what makes you confident that this can actually be meaningful on a meaningful scale?
I think the emerging markets provide us with perhaps some of the strongest evidence in favor of this global spawning idea. Many of the multinationals that graduated through subsidiary evolution, through high knowledge activities in emerging markets, mainly in China and India. We're firms that were not, that I guess were in fast clock speed industries, and which needed to take advantage of a low wage but high knowledge workforce initially. But over time, we did see a win-win outcome in many of these cities, okay, over time. Governments in these countries had fewer qualms because they did not have a high-wage, low-knowledge workforce. Because ultimately in India, in Bangalore in 1990, everybody was poor. There was nobody losing. This losing population did not exist, and so. But obviously, this is something that's going to happen over time. So I think I would say that I don't know if I've lost track of your question here, but I think that there is there are two issues. I mean, obviously, nothing is the right answer for all places in all circumstances. That's quite clear. If you have an industry which is a very slow clock speed industry, an industry which has a history of adversarial behavior, technology moves relatively slowly, I think promoting a local spawning strategy will be very, very challenging. The automotive industry is a great example of that. The heavy chemical industry is a great example of that, where you had a long 100 years of history of adversarial management worker and supplier-buyer conflict. Now, all of a sudden, when Ford cannot go to Detroit suppliers and say, oh, by the way, we've been screwing you for the last 100 years, but now we're good guys. You know, now we want to help you out. Why don't you start up? You know, we'll give you $1,000. Why don't you trust us and give us your knowledge? This is not going to happen. This is just not going to happen. Whereas a company like Google, a company like Microsoft, they can do that because they have they don't have this adversarial history. They have a long history of working with startups. They have a long history of many people who walked away with big paychecks, right? Lots of people that Microsoft goes and buys your company and gives you, hey, Sarianna, here's a check for $20 million. So, you know, there are many people like that. And so they have a history, a positive history. So when you have a negative history, I mean, old industries are going to have a problem. If you're in cement, if you're in old line, you know, all of a sudden, a path dependency is very real, no doubt about it. And path dependency of city corporate conflict is also very real. So if your city has a long history of fighting with firms, firms are not going to suddenly trust the city when this is, oh, by the way, we've all changed now. Now we're going to give you a good policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but then to some extent, the problem of disconnectedness that is present in the global economy could to some extent be alleviated kind of by the same forces, that if more value is derived from intangibles and services and the digital economy, then these firms might be more amenable to alleviate some of these sorts of effects as well. Pengfei, let me take a question from the audience, which is that, is there a place for city-specific competitive advantage in IB theory? So given the specificity that you talked about, do you have ideas on what that implies for our theorizing, our thinking about the role of place?
I think so for IB, for multinational firms, it's not overall, it's not about the cities overall, it's some specific cities that matters to their specific business. So as we discussed for the services, for the high tech, they prefer specific cities. It's not just cities overall. So I think, so for IB, so how could we understand to interpret cities in the framework, in the theoretical framework? I think it became more challenging because it's more diverse compared to the country level. So for different types of cities, they have different roles, different functions in different fields. So I think this is some theoretical challenge. So Ram also mentioned that there are some connections across the cities. So I think it's not just a specific city, it's also a city system. It's a city network. So for high-tech firms, if they build some structure across Silicon Valley, Bangalore, Shenzhen. This is something that for other firms, if we don't have this structure, it's very difficult to compete with firms with the structure. So I think it's we need to think cities not just individually, but also as a system. That's something that for IB, for multinational firms, perhaps this is some theoretical ideas we can integrate in some theory, in some arguments.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Ram, do you want to take the same question?
If we're talking about city specialization, then I think to some extent that sort of piggybacks on what I was saying earlier, which is that cities in some industries are going to have an easier time in terms of generating a win-win outcome, generating a local spawning, what we call local spawning solution than others. So let me give you a very quick example would be to say contrast a small city like Wichita, Kansas, with the example I just gave you of Detroit. Now, Detroit is going to have, I mean, if I were the mayor of Detroit, there's no easy answer there. I'm not going to say it was a magic bullet, right? I mean, the city's a mess, but there is, I don't think, we could walk in there and say, hey, I've got all the answers here, guys. We could fix it all. That's just not going to happen. We have 150 years of adversarial path dependency, decay of many, many dimensions. It's just a can of worms. It's not going to be easy to fix that. But on the other hand, you look at Wichita, Kansas, which is a relatively smaller city. Now, very, very, very few people outside of America probably heard of Wichita or even know where it is. Now, Wichita is actually in Kansas, in the middle of the US. But it is, in fact, a very high-tech city. It is, it's an aerospace cluster, and virtually every aerospace company in the world is there. Cessna is there, Boeing is there, Lear is there, Airbus is there. Which one? I mean, the Danish company Vestas is there. So it's a very, very high tech area. They don't actually have this. First of all, they have a relatively homogeneous population, much more like Scandinavia, right? So ultimately, they don't really have a lot of poor people. It was formerly a milling center where they essentially processed wheat. But they replaced that over the last 20 or 30 years very successfully to engage with the global knowledge economy in this era of aerospace. Did that very well through the beginning of World War II. I was speaking to the mayor and city council of Wichita in this Brookings Institution, and they're a great example of city success. They've done an incredibly good job, but their job was not so difficult, right? They didn't have such a difficult job. So it's not, I don't think it's a small city, big city issue. It's very much, I mean, Wichita is a very small city in the middle of nowhere, not very, very far away from everybody, but they're extremely successful and they've done very well. Finally, the national policy can matter. A good friend of mine is an advisor to the governor of Iowa, which is another, flyover state, which many people outside the US probably have not heard of. And most people think of these flyover states as basically dispossessed and, red states and all the red meat and potatoes and there's no high knowledge and so on. But you look at places in Iowa, small places like Iowa City and Des Moines and Sioux Falls, and they are high-tech city after high-tech city after high-tech city. Like General Dynamics is there, there's Lockheed Martin is there. And essentially a lot of what's going on there is through national policy, because many of these are defense contractors that the national government has specifically decided to locate in these hinterland areas. And they're creating a lot of high knowledge jobs, and a lot of these smaller cities are thriving and doing well through that. So, and again, these smaller cities tend to do a much better job of working with state, national, and city level administrators to work better together. It tends to work better together. So, I don't want to go that far, but I think for IB scholars, for studying the subnational level, it may be worth asking the question, studying, is it going forward in the future, in the 21st century, is size actually a problem? Will smaller cities actually do better now? In fact, New York and being London is just going to become especially with COVID, where people don't want to go there, nobody wants to live there anymore. Are these bigger cities going to actually have a disadvantage? And this quote unquote superstar structure may go to smaller cities. San Francisco is not a very big city. Seattle is not a very big city. Copenhagen is not a very big city. So being London and New York may actually be a big disadvantage. Maybe not, but I think this is IB scholars should study this.
Sorry for disrupting right now, but this is a question that I live in a small city by the standards of cities we talk about here. London, Ontario is about 400,000 people. What advice would you have for the mayor of a city like London, Ontario, or maybe even Bremen, who is like 600,000-700,000 people? What can the mayor of a city like that do to not be disconnected from all the fancy things happening in the global economy?
Well, that's a fantastic question, because Andreas and I were talking about exactly this question. When was that? I don't know. Andreas is in the audience here somewhere. I mean, maybe a year ago or 2 years ago when we were working on this very paper, in fact. And Andreas has this theory of death zones, for example, of London being the death zone of Toronto and so on. Now, I will give you the answer I gave Andreas, whatever it was, a year and a half ago or something. The answer I gave was, ultimately, if you're the mayor of London, you have to ask yourself, what high knowledge activities do I have going on locally? And from what I understand from Andreas, there is a very significant hospital in London. And healthcare is a very high-tech area, very globally connected. I think ultimately what you have to do as London, Ontario, is you have to try and look to the success of Rochester, Minnesota. Rochester, Minnesota is a similarly small city, but it's the home of Mayo Clinic. Because of Mayo Clinic, that is the center, that's the nexus of this entire high-tech connectivity of Rochester, Minnesota. If I were the mayor, I would go to the CEO of the hospital and say, listen, guys, what kind of research are you doing? What kind of connections do you have? And how can we help? How can we build city-to-city connections? How can we go to talk to the mayor of other cities? How can we help you increase and build your global connectivity footprint?
I think Klaus.
Yeah, Pengfei, do you have any views on that?
I don't have a solution, but I do think this is a big challenge. So if you look at some big multinational firms, which were established decades ago, their headquarters we found for some of the firms, they are from a small town, such as Walmart, Nike. So they started from a small town, and their headquarters still remain in this small town. But nowadays, I think it's a big challenge. So what we see here is these super big cities, New York, London, they are sucking up talent, jobs, innovation. That's a big advantage to attract some big firms. For small towns, rural areas, what's the challenge? I mean, what's the solution? So if you think about more theoretically, so for urbans, why there are more innovations compared to other places? Well, Jean-Jacques says this is because diversity. But diversity requires a critical mass. So that means that the size of the city, at least you should have reach some threshold. Then there is diversity of activities, different kind of people. Then there is some knowledge sharing, some social network, etc. Then innovation pops up. So I think on this perspective, that's some big challenge for small or medium-sized cities. So that's the reason why Amazon emphasized when they made the plan to select a city in North America, the city must have 1 million population. This is their criteria, one of the criteria. So in this perspective, I think economic activities have changing fundamentally. That makes some challenges to some different places. For small, medium-sized cities, I think it's a big, big challenge. So to find a solution, that's the job for IB scholars. That's also, I think, more interesting for economic geographers.
If I could add to that, Klaus, I think Pengfei mentioned a very, very important word here. I think the word is threshold. And I think nobody knows what that threshold is, really. I mean, I think economic geographers have talked about this, like Chris Thaler onwards, from 1925 onwards. They've talked about the issue of thresholds. What is the threshold below which you don't get the positive agglomeration benefits? And my answer, I don't think it'd be no. I mean, Amazon's still 1 million people, but I think 1 million is too big, to be honest. I think we have many, many examples of very successful cities in the US, much smaller than that, which are very, very high tech and very, very connected. And so clearly 50,000 is too small, or 20,000 is too small. But million is probably too big. What is the correct number? This is an empirical question. And certainly something that IB scholars in terms of MNE connectivity and city size, this is, I think, a meaty research question that people should study.
But just to add to Klaus, I think maybe after the crisis, maybe this is the opportunity for some places outside big cities, because there's big risk to live in the big cities right now. So maybe that's an opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. Let me. I'm just looking, getting a message from Dan. We've lost Christine apparently. She's not coming back, and so I've been engaging in a side conversation with Danny Shapiro, which is one of her co-authors on the paper. Technically, I've not been able to bring him in, but he's saying that the cities come in different sizes, but global city doesn't necessarily mean a huge city, which is consistent with what Ram was talking about. But he says when it comes to investment promotion, of course, there it gets more difficult for smaller firms. But the other thing for smaller firms is, of course, the way they tie themselves into other networks of other cities, right? So if you are in the, what Andreas Schotter called the dead zone, then the infrastructure is how quickly you get to Detroit, or how quickly you get to Toronto by various means of communication, transportation, is very important. I do want to, I have one. Usually in this webinars, we have one question that relates to COVID, and even though both of the remaining panelists have talked about it, we haven't really addressed that. Pengfei was emphasizing that knowledge spillovers are very, very micro, like you were talking about 500 to 1,000 meters. That's the sort of where the knowledge is flowing. And Ram, in his presentation, you were saying, well, actually, the fact that the people now work in the suburbs as opposed to city center is not going to make a big difference. Could you just spend 1 minute or so, share your reflections of whether some of the messages you got out of your original research still apply given the changes we see due to COVID?
If I could just jump in very quickly, I think what we're seeing to some extent is in the short term, I think this effect is not going to be that dramatic, simply because a lot of the interconnectivity that we had in the past has continued to be, we're continuing to leverage. We're leveraging what we already had. In probably the 18 months to 36-month window, global innovation networks are not going to be affected that much because people that we used to go to coffee shops with, and the guy who was in my next door office that I used to work next to, and so on, I continue to meet them online, and those things are going to continue to happen. And so just right now, Sarianna and you and I, we're and Pengfei, we're meeting and discussing. And to some extent, we have a lot of social capital amongst ourselves since we know each other already. I think the problem we're going to see going forward is 3 years, 5 years into the future, if this situation does not rapidly alleviate, if it remains as it is at the moment, then in 2021, 2022, if there are no more face-to-face conferences, I seriously believe that there will be new connections will not be formed. New connections be ultimately all those connections that you make in face-to-face, those new connections will not be formed. And we will start seeing negative effects in terms of innovation and knowledge probably 4 or 5 years in the future. So if this is a new normal, if this indeed is a new normal, the global innovation system is going to be severely negatively affected.
Very good. So from my side, I'm looking at the time and I'm getting hints from Klaus that it's starting to be time to wrap up. I think we have exhausted the questions. There was one question for Christine, which we couldn't take because she was unfortunate.
Sarianna, sorry for disrupting me. I managed to get Danny Shapiro in here. Danny is a co-author on the paper with Christine, and I was hoping that he can answer the question that Christine couldn't answer. Sorry, we're running out over time, but I think it's worthwhile I want to have that an answer to that. Danny, final
well, first of all, thank you for promoting me, and I'm glad I'm not in my pajamas, which was very nearly the situation. What was the question?
I think the question was the question that was raised in the commentary that on your paper in JIBP, which is the implications for other cities and also has implications for democracy. So if cities drive the national policy agenda, that is really negative for, in that case, Leeds or Manchester or wherever the co-author or that author was from.
Okay, I think we do have to look at this a little more carefully, and more research is required. But the evidence from political scientists, which we cite in our paper, shows that cities are creating these networks which are quasi-diplomatic. So cities are global cities, but when I say global, I don't mean just New York and London. I mean the whole range of cities that have influence, which can be smaller cities, as Ram pointed out. Those cities have created little networks of cities that have, for example, engaged more heavily on climate change than have their national governments. So when institutional voids are emerging at the international level, cities have stepped up their activities in some of the places where those voids have become most obvious. Now, I don't see this as a democratic deficit in any way. I see this as actually an attempt to fill a democratic deficit. If your national government is not capable of taking action because national governments can't agree on this, citizens in cities and cities themselves who are elected are taking such action. So I'm actually quite optimistic about this, but I think we do have to study it a lot more.
Can I just make an editorial side note? There's a very nice paper coming out in JIBS. It's online available now on the Guggenheim in Helsinki. And this is a case where, you know, if you harbor any, because I agree with you, you can clearly make the argument that actually city level diplomacy is filling in an area where policy hasn't been locally responsive enough and can't be. But the Guggenheim is an opposite example that is kind of linked to what Pengfei was talking about with the Amazon headquarters, where there are completely different interests who are saying, well, actually, city diplomacy doesn't represent us at all. And there is a massive democratic deficit where the city is pursuing projects that are prestigious, that are thought to be whatever, in someone's eyes, promoting the public interest, but where there is a democratic deficit, I think quite visible. So in the spirit of cooperation and joint research, I point people to the JIBS paper by Tiina Ritvala and Rebecca Piekari, and I'm sorry, I forgot the third author, but from Aalto. It's a very interesting story.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm very glad we raised a lot of questions. We tried to answer some questions, but further research is needed. But I think also further discussions on the policy implications of what we are doing and what these papers and the empirical evidence we have really imply for decision makers in business, in national government, in local government. Those conversations need to continue, and I hope we will be able to link up among each other to have those conversations. I have here on the slide again the papers, so if anybody needs the references, I could click on the links here and I get straight to the paper, but I'm not going to do that now because I know all of you know where to find JIBS and JIBP. Anyway, I just want to draw your attention to the next webinar. It's going to focus on the human capital of the multinational enterprise and how MNEs can manage that. It will be on September 10, but probably in a different time slot because we need to accommodate speakers around the world. So we're not going to have our usual time slot, but probably a little bit earlier. That webinar will be in memoriam of Alida Smalkian, who was the first author of a paper that we just published, but who sadly passed away a few days ago. Guest moderator will be Dana Minbayeva from Copenhagen Business School, who is also the area editor-in-chief responsible for human resource management. And with that, thank you everyone for your contributions, for your questions, and see you again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.